I work a busy office 9 to 5 job during the week, which can be very stressful but also quite mundane. The same routine day in and day out often feels tedious and leaves me longing for a sense of adventure when it comes to the weekends, which I always have off work. Often, this longing leads me to go wild camping on my own. Other than work, I have no other commitments in my life. No girlfriend, wife, or kids. So my weekends are mine only, with no one around to worry about me being gone for the weekend. I consider wild camping one of my ways of unwinding. When I decide to go, I usually select a random large forest on the map where I can go to and return within a weekend. I always pick an offbeat location, as my intention is to never disturb or be disturbed by other people. I calculate and accept any risks by doing this, and never plan to stay in one location for longer than a night. I enjoy the thrill of being on my own in a forest in the dead of night and having some quality me time. Just me and nature. Last weekend was one such weekend where I decided I needed to get away. It was the first weekend after the first week back at work following the Christmas break. The first week back after the holidays is always the worst, and it always feels like the longest week of the year. I picked an area of forest which required roughly 5 hours of driving in each direction. I don't mind the driving. If anything, the further the better, but there's a limit, as I have to travel home to make sure I'm ready for another mundane week of work. I gathered all my camping gear and set off just before lunchtime on the Saturday, which meant that I had just about enough light on arrival to get my camp set up. I like to keep my camping gear as light as possible when wild camping. I never plan to light fires and usually just pack my single-person tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, pocket knife, protein bars, water bottle, large stacks of colored reflective ribbons, and other items not worth mentioning. Note that I do not bring my phone with me nor any form of electronic payment. The whole point is to get away from technology. When I arrived at my location and completed the first challenge of finding somewhere remote to park the car, I usually go on a bit of a hike to find a good spot to set up camp, far enough away from the road, tying subtle blue ribbons to twigs on trees to guide me back to the car. You would not spot the ribbons unless you had a torch and were looking for them. A perfect spot for me is one that has enough flat space to pitch a tent, plenty of shrubbery around to provide some shelter from wind, and a spot mostly covered by trees to reduce any rainfall. The spot I found this day was 11 out of 10 perfect. It had a nice flat area, an immediate perimeter of thick shrubbery, and just enough clearance above to pitch the tent. A tree with a large number of thick branches and leaves provided shelter. It was the kind of spot that, if you were a random person, you would not easily spot unless you were specifically looking for it. After some time, I was set. I finished setting up my tent just as it started getting really dark. All that was left to do was secure the tent, snuggle into my sleeping bag, and become one with the nature around me. I was comfortable for a couple of hours, nearly drifting off when, all of a sudden, I felt it. I needed to poop. I let out a frustrated sigh as I got out of my sleeping bag and put my protective clothing back on. I had to head back out into the wilderness in the dead of night to find a spot to take a dump. I had a rule to never do my business near camp, as I had an accident once, which is not important to this story. I grabbed my torch, pocket knife, and reflective ribbons and headed out of the tent. Before turning on the torch, I took a second to take in my surroundings. It was pitch black and dead quiet. I was expecting insects or birds or sounds of animals stirring as I bundled out of the tent, but all I could hear was the occasional blow of wind in my ears. This made me uneasy and hyper-aware, which didn't help the sensation I was feeling in my bowels. Regardless of how I felt, I pressed on to find a spot, to crap in the opposite direction of my route, back to the car, tying red ribbons to inconspicuous twigs on trees so I could find my way back to camp. After spending about 15 minutes finding a spot, doing the deed and tidying up, I scanned my flashlight around, searching for the glints of red that would take me to camp, when I instead got the glint of something else, a little further from my crap spot. When I focused my beam of light on the spot again, I noticed something metallic ahead, which immediately piqued my curiosity and gave me cause for concern. There shouldn't be anything metallic this far from civilization. I had to investigate, so I began making my way closer to the metal glint, using green ribbons to mark my journey in the trees. As I got closer to the metal object, I found that the forest was giving way to a sizable clearing, which then gave way to a structure as I closed in on the source of the reflection. It was a cabin, in the woods. Horror cliches aside, this did not look like your typical cabin in the woods. A large antenna protruded from the roof of the cabin into the night sky, towering over the nearby trees. It looked like there was some serious tech fixed to the metallic structure. There were also other aerials and antennas sticking out from the sides of the cabin. I got closer to the cabin and immediately noticed the cabin had similarities to the outside environment. It was still cold, dark, and quiet. Despite the amount of tech installed on the tower, the cabin did not seem to be active. I continued walking around the outside of the cabin, scanning its exterior. If you took away all the antennas, it would look unassuming. That's when I noticed the door into the cabin. It was ajar. I stood there and hesitated for longer than I should have. I did a quick scan around the clearing and a quick look into the trees to check the coast was clear, and I entered. The first thing that struck me was the dust. Lots and lots of dust. It was clear to me now that this place was no longer in use. For the amount of tech there was installed outside, the inside was disappointing. It was empty, only containing metal shelves with nothing on them. As I was leaving in a huff of disappointment, I noticed a document hanging up next to the door. The document seemed to have 3 different parts. The first part had Korean symbols, the second part had numbers, and the third part had English, or rather Latin script, letters, arranged in alphabetical order numerous times. I wondered whether this was some Korean to English translation guide, and then I wondered what on earth Korean writing was doing here. For information, I am not in Korea. I live in an English-speaking and writing country. I must admit, I was tempted to take the document but decided against it, as it would likely end up in the rubbish. I shut the door to the cabin and made my way back to the camp via my crap spot, guided by the reflective ribbons, untying them as I made my way back. I secured my tent, got back into my sleeping bag, and unexpectedly fell into a deep sleep, tired from the extra walk and exploration. I woke the next morning in a bit of a panic, as I never usually plan to fall asleep when wild camping. I like to be alert and keep a listen out, but I soon calmed as it took me a minute to realize that I'm still alive. All my things are still present, and my tent is still secure. I exited my tent and took some time to pack all my things up and hike back to my car, untying all the ribbons from the trees. I made the best endeavor to collect them all, but if not, they eventually biodegrade. While on my long drive home, I thought back to the night before and considered the cabin in the woods. I thought about how peculiar it was that the cabin was there. It didn't look like it was built for anyone to stay in. It was a small cabin. I would have said it could have been a hunter's cabin if it weren't for all the communication technology sticking out of it. I kept busy with these thoughts for most of the journey home, and before I realized it, 5 hours had passed, and I was back in my neighborhood. Since the discovery of the cabin, the rest of the wild camping event was uneventful. I parked, picked up my bag from the car, locked it, headed to my front door, and opened it up. Home sweet home. All was as I'd left it. Just before I stepped past the threshold into my home, I noticed something white tied to the floor. Strange, I thought. There's no post on Sundays. I picked up the object and quickly noticed something familiar. A green ribbon. One of my reflective green ribbons. What the fuck? I untied the ribbon, and it unfurled a Polaroid photo taken of me, asleep in my tent. Just before I completely shit myself, I noticed some writing at the bottom of the photo. Korean writing. The Korean writing was, "유리는 당신을 봅니다." I realized that I had been standing at the threshold of my house with the door wide open and suddenly felt very exposed and vulnerable. So I quickly got inside, shutting and locking the door. I looked back down at the photo. I started reading the translation under my breath. When translated, the Korean text read, "We see you." First of all, sorry for my bad English. I'm not a native speaker. This story happened to me and a friend of mine 2 months ago. A bit of context. My friend and I often like to smoke one in the middle of the night in his village, and usually it's pretty chill. But this time, I thought we would walk to our local football field, which is in the middle of the woods. As we began to walk towards the forest, we already heard something whisper behind us. And in general, it felt like we were being followed and watched, but we thought nothing of it. As we set foot in the football field area, we sat on a bench about 150 meters away from the field. In front of us were a lot of bushes and small trees. I already felt a bit uneasy because there were no lights and it was almost pitch black. But my friend said he had been here before and it was safe, and no one lived around here. So we got back to talking and smoking. After around 10 minutes, we heard a silent screech. Keep in mind, it was 10 minutes later, so we didn't feel anything from smoking. We just looked at each other and were completely silent. A few seconds passed, and there was another screech, this time much closer and louder, and the motion detector 10 meters away went on. I was already standing, ready to leave or run away from whatever this was, but my friend, stupid as he is, called out something like, "Fuck off." Right after he did so, we heard more screeching and movement behind the bushes, and we were both frozen in fear. As I stood there, the motion detector was giving off a small amount of light, which allowed me to see a little bit. And I saw 2 legs behind the bushes, gray, dirty jeans, and black boots. On the side of the leg, there was, I don't know how to describe it, like a long knife. As soon as I saw it, I grabbed my friend and began sprinting back to the village. The next day, we walked back to check if we had just confused something with wood or whatever. But as we pulled up, there were 2 cop cars standing there that told us we needed to turn around. We didn't ask anything. We just turned and drove off. To this day, we don't know who it was or what they had planned for us. It was the fall of '94 when my dad and I decided to go camping at Yellowstone. We planned to stay at a cabin the first night, then leave for the forest and camp there the second and third nights. The cabin was fine, cozy, but a bit rustic. The worst thing was a rat in the master bedroom, which scurried out from under the bed just as we settled in. Other than that, it was a comfortable spot for our first night. We spent the evening playing cards and enjoying the warm glow of the fireplace, with the sounds of the forest surrounding us. Early the next morning, we packed up our gear and left for the forest. The trail led us deeper into the wilderness, where the trees grew taller and denser, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The forest felt alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. What was confusing, though, was that even though it was a popular trail that led to a popular area, it was secluded. No footprints, no trash, nothing. We found a small clearing to set up camp. It was a perfect spot with a clear view of the sky above. We spent the day exploring, fishing in a nearby stream, and enjoying the beauty of the forest. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we huddled around a campfire, sharing ghost stories until we grew tired. Sometime around 2:30 a.m., I woke up with an uneasy feeling. The campfire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. I stepped out of my tent, feeling the cold night air on my skin. I walked to the edge of the woods to take a leak. As I was finishing up, I felt a sudden chill that wasn't just from the cold. I looked up and saw it, a face staring at me from a nearby bush. The face was pale, with a gruesome, toothless grin. But the worst part was the eyes. They were all white, with no pupils or irises, but they were bloodshot. They stared back at me, unblinking, just watching. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a sprint towards my dad's tent, glancing back over my shoulder. But when I looked again, the bush was empty. The face had vanished. I reached my dad's tent and threw open the cover, shouting for him to wake up. He instantly rushed out of the tent, wielding a flashlight. I led him to the bush and described what I saw. He looked around, shaking his head, and told me there was nothing there and to go back to my tent and try to sleep. But then, as he glanced around the clearing, his face turned pale. I could see sweat beading on his forehead, and his eyes were wide with terror. He grabbed my hand, trembling. "You know what?" he said, his voice shaky. "Let's just leave." I didn't understand why he suddenly changed his mind, but I knew he had seen something that frightened him even more than what I had seen. I started to walk towards my tent to grab my stuff, but he stopped me, saying to leave it. Confused, but trusting him, I followed as we quickly made our way to the nearest ranger station. It wasn't far, and we had a flashlight, but I clung to him the whole way. When we reached the ranger station, my dad spoke to a ranger, describing what he had seen. I couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but I saw the ranger's face grow pale. He offered to escort us back to our car, and my dad accepted immediately. When we reached the car, we drove off without looking back. As the first light hit the car in our drive home, I asked my dad what he had seen. He hesitated for a moment, then told me. He said he saw the face, just as I had described. But what he said next is what has scared me for the past 48 years. When he saw the face, it wasn't in the bush where I had seen it. It was in my tent.